Hey, welcome back, everyone, to Israel Matters, where we discuss the matters that matter most to Israel. And as always, I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, and I'm here with Elliot Chodoff. We started discussing Iran. We finished up dealing with Russia and what Iran and Russia are up to in Syria. But before we get there, you had mentioned to me that you wanted to comment on something that we discussed last time.
Yes, specifically about the scriptural part of our talk last week. I was giving some thought about it. And first, I have to say that I'm one of those guys who, and I'm pretty sure you agree with me, that believe that there is no good translation of scripture. They start with not so good and they work their way down from there.
Yeah, the way I always put it is that every translation is a commentary. Meaning,
Yes.
I'm not anti-translations, but we have to understand that, and translators know this, a translator's job is really to interpret, because nothing can ever substitute the original language.
Right, I think that's true in any literature. Certainly if we're talking about scripture and not only God's word, but God's words.
Yeah.
So to drill down. Anyway, you were talking last week about 23rd Psalm, and there are a whole bunch of parts of that verse, but I want to focus on two of them to sort of expand on the lesson that you gave last time. The first is what is generally translated as "I shall fear no evil." The Hebrew "lo ira ra" doesn't really translate that way. If I were to translate, and you're the rabbi, so correct me if I've gotten this wrong, it's more, I will not fear bad.
Correct.
Okay, the not is to fear, not to the object, and ra is really bad, something bad happening, not evil in the sense that we normally use the word evil.
Maybe. Okay.
Okay.
I'm listening.
Okay. Further on, thy rod and thy staff comfort me. The Hebrew yenachamuni could be comfort, but it's more to console me.
That's true. Yeah.
Okay. So here's what I'm thinking when I put this together. There are many chapters in Psalms that talk about God's protection. 91 being one of the classics, but certainly far from the only one.
Sure.
Where it talks about I will guard you.
Sure. Or 121. Sure. Lots of them.
Right. Okay. Where the word shomer is used to guard, magen to shield, and so on. Here it seems to say something different. That even though I go through this place of danger, and I don't want to define, but valley of the shadow of death. I will not fear bad because you will console me, because even if it happens to me, I will not fear it.
Because we only get consoled if some tragedy has already occurred.
Exactly.
So I'm not even it's not that I'm not going to fear it because you're going to prevent it. I'm not going to fear it because even if it happens, I know that in the aftermath, you're there with me. Oh, wow. Yes. That's a powerful insight. That's a powerful spiritual insight that, like, in terms of drawing some sustenance from the scripture. Wow. That's very powerful.
Thank you.
Wow. All right.
Okay.
Wow. That's something to think about. You can pause the video right now and meditate on that. But Elliot, if I could draw us back into Syria,
yes,
Iran. I mean, we're talking. Iran's role in Syria is not unconnected. It's part of the larger role that it's playing in the world as a bad actor in terms of what it's doing in the Gulf and what it's doing and what it's and the saber rattling that is constantly going on between it and Saudi Arabia, and everything that Iran is involved in is all connected. And Hamas and Hezbollah, it's all the same.
Yes.
So we had a headline, if we could just tie this conversation into what's happening right now, there's a headline in the papers basically today that there was a large explosion, of course unexplained, that's the way it goes. There was a large explosion that took place near Parchin, near the base of Parchin, which is where they're trying to develop nuclear weapons. I saw another headline from just a couple days ago about how their enrichment of uranium is really reaching a critical stage.
Yes.
So maybe talk about that, and then bring us back into how this impacts Israel.
Okay. So first of all, the reports, and again, this is something that only happened less than 12 hours ago. The reports are that there was a massive explosion either near or in the base. That's not clear. It was visible from Tehran, which is some 20 kilometers. That's, call it 12 miles.
So this isn't a bomb. This isn't
this is a boom.
Like if something is, if an explosion, just for anyone who's not familiar, it should be obvious. For an explosion to be sensed 20 kilometers away, we're talking about something very significant.
They saw the fireball 20 kilometers away. They heard the boom. So this was something massive. It wasn't a building blowing up. The Iranian regime, they couldn't hide it, obviously, claimed that it was a gas reservoir explosion and that nobody was injured. That's their line. That's what they're sticking to at the moment. And that nothing on the base was damaged and so on. Given that this is a regime that lies automatically, I take any statement that they make with a grain of salt, even if it's true. That this is one of the problems of a lying regime, that it's possible, but there are a few things here that make it, let's say, that make another hypothesis interesting and also very much possible. One is that it occurred at Parchin, which is really one of the key targets. The International Atomic Energy Authority has not been allowed to supervise, to investigate there. In other words, something's going on there that the Iranians don't want anybody to know about. That's first of all. And nuclear comes to mind very quickly. It's a place where we know that they've done nuclear research. The fact that it happened in the middle of the night has two possible explanations to either to support their story or not. One is that in the middle of the night, you're on a skeleton crew. It's possible that some sort of error happens that causes an accident. That's a possibility.
No, but an accident hold on. For an accident, there's so many security measures and like layers of, for some accident to happen off work hours to produce such a massive explosion. I mean, this isn't, we think that way, kind of like almost like from like, evil men in comic books who have like underground headquarters. Right. How can an accident like that happen in the middle of the night?
How could an accident happen at Chernobyl? Accidents happen.
Yeah, but Chernobyl's decades ago, and you'd think that.
I'm not advocating that hypothesis. I'm saying it's within the realm of possible, and I don't want to reject something. Okay, I don't want to reject it out of hand. On the other hand, if it were a strike to hit something, and the fact that it's at Parchin already, points something in that direction, because that's one of the data points you have to take into account. It doesn't just happen at random. It's not at some place out in the middle of nowhere. Striking in the middle of the night makes sense, because if you don't want to inflict lots of casualties, that's when you would do it. It's also when systems tend to be more down in general, even if there are alerts.
Meaning if this was someone trying to strike at the Iranians,
correct. This would be
that's when their defenses are down, and that's when it's easier to operate undetected.
Defenses in the sense that people are behind all defenses, even electronic technological ones. And midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, is when people are not as alert as they are at 11, 12 o'clock in the morning, noontime. And airstrike, missile strike, ground strike, cyber strike. I mean, today you can't rule anything out, but it would certainly fit into a pattern that we've been following, and we've been saying outright that that's part of our policy. We're not going to allow them to get nuclear weapons capability, and we're not going to allow.
Are you implying that this might have been a strike by Israel?
I'm saying that that's one reasonable hypothesis given the data that we have at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it could be America too. I mean, it could be combined. It could be lots of things. It certainly has those kind of prints on it as, I would call it, a discussable possibility. I'm not saying that, I mean, I don't know. We may have done it. It may have been an accident, but it would certainly, the argument that it was done by Israel in order to set back their nuclear capability, so far, at least what we have in terms of reports, would fit into that model as well.
Wow. Okay.
And if it was done without leaving footprints, that puts it a little bit more in the direction of us than anybody else, because we're pretty good at that.
Wow.
The Americans might do something like that, but they don't worry about leaving footprints. You know,
and they tend to make statements.
Well, that's what I mean. In other words,
right.
They don't have an issue of saying, "Hey, we did it. You don't like it? Too bad."
Wow.
Being a superpower gives you that license.
So how does this? I mean, first of all, this is yet another reminder that coronavirus has not paralyzed activity in this regard. It hasn't paralyzed anything.
Right.
When you said before that the inspectors from the international
Atomic
community have not, this is not a place they've been allowed to visit. You're saying that even before the U.S. Pulled out of the nuclear deal,
yes,
that this was an area that, even though the nuclear deal ostensibly gave full access, this in practice, this is a place that no one was ever allowed to visit.
Yeah, the full access of the nuclear deal was, how can I put it, neither full nor access. It was, you know, kind of Talmudic. You invert the verbs and everything works. Day is night, night is day.
Wow.
And they complained about it. As a matter of fact, recently, given information that we gave over to the International Atomic Energy Agency, they came to the conclusion that Iran has accelerated their weapons development significantly in the past, in the recent past.
So the headline about that I mentioned, which was much more under the radar, that recently there's been reports that their enrichment of uranium has really reached a critical point, might be intimately connected with this explosion in Parchin.
Right. And again,
is there, how close are there residents and citizens to this area that might be even impacted by such a thing?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. It's way out of the city. So not close. And keep in mind that we're not talking about the destruction of a reactor. We're talking about a destruction of facilities that may not have a particular nuclear element. You know, just to use the analogy, when we destroyed Saddam's nuclear reactor in 1981, it was before it went online. It wasn't a nuclear event at all. It was a destruction of a building that was going to go nuclear. So whether there's nuclear material involved in this or not, and again, this is all speculation, it doesn't mean that the eruption, the explosion itself, had a necessarily nuclear aspect to it.
Right. In other words, this could have been connected to other, even if it was a strike against their military capabilities, that doesn't mean it was nuclear.
Again, it could be a strike against elements of the development of a nuclear capability without necessarily taking out or destroying or erupting, I think is because what we're talking about here, something massively radioactive or dangerous. This is not an online reactor blowing up and spewing radiation all over the place.
Okay, so let's bring this around. Let's bring this around to Israel. And here's my question as you're talking about this, because this is like, okay, this thing happened, and of course the Israelis never make statements. They never show their cards.
Right.
Let's say the Iran. Let's say that it was an attack by the Israelis,
okay,
or by the Americans.
Right.
What interest would Iran have in concealing that fact? In other words, why isn't it in their best interests to actually say that it was an attack by the Israelis? Meaning, why wouldn't they want to promote that as a way of maybe positioning themselves as victims, or seeing, saying outright that this is a provocation and then unleashing Hezbollah? Like, why? Okay. Why would they not want it to be seen as an attack by the Israelis or by the Americans?
Because here I don't think that Iran is looking to fight a diplomatic battle with us or with the United States. In other words, what you're suggesting would be to go to the quote-unquote court of public opinion. The court of public opinion doesn't really care at this point. Europe is fed up with them. The Russians don't particularly like them. They've got their allies who are their allies regardless. Showing that they were struck actually makes them look weak, which is not a good thing in the world that they live in. And I don't mean Muslim, I'm talking about the world of power. It's not about Iran or Shiites or Muslims or anything like that. In the realm of power, you don't look weak. And they were humiliated by the Mossad raid that went into their archives. If this is shown to be, again, by whatever means, an attack that got through all of their defenses and caused huge damage, they only lose face.
I see.
Accidents can happen. A little embarrassing maybe, but not as embarrassing as your enemy sneaking into one of your most important research bases and causing massive damage. In terms of response, here I'm going to come back to something I said last time, that the Persians invented chess. If you allow your adversary to change your timetables purely because they irritated you, then you're letting them take over the game. Okay, one of my ongoing sayings is, he who sets the pace wins the battle. It's exclusively mine. This is true in sports as well. Allowing us to determine when they do something is not their style. And by the way, it's one of the arguments in general against automatic retaliation. I've had that issue with us in Gaza and with Lebanon. If every time they do something, we respond in a certain way, at a certain point, they are initiating for us and deciding for us what we're going to be doing. And that's a downside. I'm not saying it's necessarily
they're controlling the pace of the game, and
exactly.
and they're taking we've allowed them to take the lead in the dance.
Exactly, precisely.
Right.
Now that's not an argument against never retaliating, but
right, because there's a price to be paid for not retaliating too.
Exactly, but you have to keep in mind there's a price to be paid for retaliating every time based on what they do. Okay, this is part of the balance of calculating in strategy and tactics. They're not in a position to do something significant right now, And I can tell you that with certainty, because if they were, they would have done it. In other words, they're not waiting for us, they're waiting for themselves. And that's part of what we've been doing in Syria for the past few years, constantly striking every time they make some sort of progress, move forward, position equipment, set up bases, we strike them. Now, frankly, we're doing that brilliantly on a tactical level. I think strategically we're falling behind because we're not hitting everything. In other words, even if they're moving ahead at 10, 15, 20% of the pace that they would like to be moving ahead, we're not driving them back, we're just slowing down their forward movement. And
what would, so, you know, this might be a good question to, you know, to bring us really into how all this affects Israel, and maybe, you know, table some of the, you know, this is a big conversation about Iran,
right.
and we didn't know we'd be talking about a recent explosion today, but
right.
but what you just said really brings us into, you know, what we care about in terms of going to bed every night, waking up every morning, being concerned for Israel, praying for Israel. So the question is, what you just said is very important. Tactically, we're doing a wonderful job, you know, with these surgical strikes at Iranian positions in Syria, when they're trying to move weapons across Syria into Lebanon. We're great at knocking them out. We're slowing down their progress, but you know, but that strategically we're losing because they are making progress. It might be at a slow pace. So the question then is, from a strategic standpoint, what would you rather see Israel doing? Because, you know, short of just, you know, throwing down the gauntlet and entering into an all-out war, what would you like to see Israel do strategically to correct that problem?
No, I don't think there is a correction. I think that what we're doing is the best we can do. I mean, quantitatively, you can always do a little bit more, but that's not a criticism. That's just that's whatever you do, you can always do a little bit more.
That's just more of the tactical.
It's more tactics. There is, look, our objective is to prevent them from getting to our border without going to war. And I think that this is a reality of democracies in general. Not to say that democracies are perfect, but in general, democracies don't want to go to war. And we see time and again being drawn into wars, and again, with mistakes, and there are always going to be mistakes and bad decisions and that sort of thing. But being drawn into wars that, in retrospect, you could say, you know what, had we done something earlier, we could have prevented this mess. And you know, take World War II as a classic example. Everybody knew who the problem was and what the problem was, and it could have been dealt with in 1935. But nobody wanted to go to war. They'd just gotten out of one. And we're in the same position. I think it's a legitimate position. Going to war is a bad thing. So
yeah, but our enemies use our unwillingness to go to war as a tremendous advantage, because it gives them cover to you know,
to move forward,
you know, to steadily rearm and get themselves ready. But what, you know, is it possible that kind of like along the lines of you know, of the way Reagan won the Cold War, that maybe just keeping your enemy at bay and kind of staying one step ahead of him technologically and financially, and you know, and that just if you're dealing with an enemy that you know is a paper tiger economically, that the hope is that if you just keep inflicting these little wounds and you keep slowing them down, that eventually they will collapse. Is that, I mean, is that strategically a valid way of thinking here?
It's strategically valid, although it has a certain amount of wishful thinking mixed into it.
For sure, yeah. Hope is not a strategy.
No, exactly. It makes sense on a certain level. And look, here's one of those great things. You mentioned Reagan and you know, the end of the Soviet Union. It's brilliant if it works.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Right.
If you're Chamberlain, it doesn't look so good. So there is logic to it. Look, I think it's the best strategy we've got because we don't want to go to war, and we certainly don't want to initiate a war. I should also make the point that there's a difference, and this has come up in discussions that I've had with lots of people in lectures and on social media. There's a huge difference between preemption and prevention. Okay, prevention is early. In other words, if we went after Iran now, it would be preventive. If we
That's
did
kind of like or like destroying the Iraqi reactor.
That's right. That was preventive.
Right.
What we did in 1967 was preemptive. They were on the borders, they were lined up, and we preempted their strike. A preemptive attack is much more justifiable, and I'm not just talking about in public opinion, I'm talking about in logic as well. Because there is a point where the wishful thinking just disappears. They're lined up and they say they're going to kill you, and you say, okay, here they are. We're not guessing.
I'm going to shoot them first. Right.
That's right. Okay. Where preventive is much more problematic because you don't know for sure. You're going way ahead.
And in the court of public opinion, you didn't have a justifiable provocation.
If you add opinion in general, and here I'm talking about domestic as well as foreign, friends, enemies, and the like, it's much more difficult to defend. Now, if it's a single strike, like taking out a nuclear reactor, so everybody complains, but you've done it, it's finished. In other words, by the time they're condemning it, it's over, the planes are home, the guys are, the pilots are drinking coffee or whatever they're doing after a mission. And so, okay, so I did it. A war is an entirely different story. And then you're talking about how do your allies respond? Do they justify it? Do they help you? Do they harm you? Do they cut you off? Do they embargo you? And so on. Right. And there you've got a bigger problem. One of my absolute iron laws, and by the way, this one works not only in strategy and international relations, it works on the individual interpersonal level as well, is that a preventive policy that succeeds will always be condemned. Okay, now it sounds like a paradox, but it's not. Okay, in other words, if you do something to prevent something from happening, you will be condemned for what you did because nothing happened.
And it looked aggressive, right?
Well, you can't prove the negative. In other words, you can't prove that you prevented something.
That's such an important insight. All right, Elliot, we've gone long.
Okay.
And, so we're going to continue this. This is, one of the things I love about what we're doing, and I've heard from a few people who have been watching these videos, that we are really digging into the full picture of what's going on. And so much happens when we read headlines, when we read news stories, that we're just getting shallow snippets.
Yes, and no context.
Well, and no context, because that's just that's the nature of the medium, and we're doing something much more thorough here. At the same time, we don't want these videos to go on too long, so we're gonna have to wrap up here. Why don't you just send us off with what should we expect any follow-up in terms of action, in terms of reaction, in terms of, or is this the kind of explosion and because of the nature of it that it'll just fade from memory quickly? What do you see, going forward for us? If
we did it, and the Iranians would know it, and this is one of those things also where they may never admit it and we'll never admit it, but they know that we know that we know that they know, kind of a thing. They could very well plan a terrorist response there. I could see Hezbollah not on our border, but somewhere else against Israeli or Jewish targets, something on the high seas, something cyber. And then if it works really well, they would then say, we did this in response to what the Israelis did. That's a possibility.
So so that would mean that for Israel, our defense is probably on a heightened alert, and
well, I think we're on heightened alert anyway.
All the time. Yeah. Okay. All right, wonderful. All right, Elliot, we got to stop here. This has been
Okay.
amazing. Again, really, I've never played chess. I'm not very good at chess.
Okay.
And I played it when I was very young. My kids play chess, and it's just fascinating to hear these. How this really is very much a chess game, but I think it's also kind of a backgammon game where there's strategy, but there's also some rolls of the dice involved.
Of course.
All right, thank you very much. Elliot,
Always a pleasure.
this is awesome, and there's so many issues to talk about when we talk about what matters to Israel and the matters that matter most to Israel. Thank you, all of you, for watching, for listening, and please share this. Tell other people about it. People who are concerned with Israel, people who really want to know how to understand what we're going through and what to have in mind as we continue to pray for the state of Israel, for the people of Israel, and for what God is doing in the world.